Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video we're going to be answering the question, what are natural kinds? Now, natural kinds are groups or types of objects which occur naturally in the world. They exist independent of our choice to classify or study them. We might say that scientific realism is successful if the way that science classifies objects maps onto naturally occurring kinds in the world. So what does that mean? Basically what we're saying is natural kinds are types of things which exist naturally in the world. And if we're right about scientific realism, what we're doing in science is we're trying to figure out what those types are, and then put words and classifications and conditions for existing in that type on those things. If that didn't make sense, let's look at some examples. So the realist will claim that examples of natural kinds can be found throughout science. These might include things like elements. So hydrogen would be a natural kind, a naturally occurring type of thing, and then individual clumps of hydrogen would fit that. Compounds also might fit into this, such as carbon dioxide or water. These would be a natural kind of thing. And they naturally occur in the world, and we as scientists have figured out, oh look, we discovered this is a kind of thing, this carbon dioxide or this water. Or more controversial kinds like species, such as Homo sapiens. Are Homo sapiens, humans, a kind of thing or not? And does that kind of thing naturally occur in the world? We're not saying do humans naturally occur in the world as in do individuals occur in the world, but is the type human a natural type that exists? Or is that just a way we like to talk about the world? Or types such as galaxies, such as types of galaxies such as elliptical or spiral, and so on and so forth. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, we're going to really dig into natural kinds in this video, so keep watching. There are a variety of questions for the proponent of natural kinds, which can be roughly sorted into three categories: metaphysical questions, semantic questions, and questions from the philosophy of science. In this video, we're going to very, very briefly examine some of these questions as well as a few of the answers. In future videos, we'll delve a little bit deeper into some of those positions. So, one metaphysical question is ontological. Do natural kinds exist? And what kinds of things are they? What kinds of things are kinds? It sounds like a confusing sentence, but what types of things are kind of these sets or groupings of naturally occurring objects? Some think they are separate, irreducible entities, that this kind is a separate entity from universals or properties or ideas, what have you. Some think that they, in fact, can be reduced to universals or clusters of properties. Another question around the metaphysics of natural kinds is, are they, in fact, natural, or are they simply conventions which we as humans use to delineate groups of objects? This is kind of what I was getting into a little bit with the original discussion of what natural kinds are. Are these things something that exists in the world and we as scientists go out and try to discover them, or are they just ways that we as scientists try to classify the world to better talk about and understand it, but not something that exists on some fundamental level? Or perhaps, in fact, there are just many overlapping natural kinds which are all natural, and we as humans just pick out some of them that we want to use, but there's hundreds of others that also exist. Now, some positions about the metaphysics of natural kinds include naturalism, a view corresponding to scientific realism, that there are actual, real natural kinds which scientists discover. This also is sometimes known as a type of realism, but there's another position about natural kinds that's also called realism, so it can get confusing, so it's easier to just call this one naturalism. But this is saying that there is some real kind out there that a scientist is looking for. It's not just something we call a group of objects because it helps for us to talk about them. Conventionalism, which is on the other end of the spectrum, that natural kinds are not real beyond the ways that scientists just talk about or classify things. And even promiscuous realism, which is a kind of view in between these two, which basically says there are lots of different ways that you could classify natural kinds, and there's going to be kinds that overlap, so something is going to fit into a bunch of different natural kinds, and we just end up picking out a few. So if you get two natural kind descriptions that overlap or don't perfectly match, it's not because there's not some underlying natural kind. In fact, it's because there's an infinite number of them, and we've just found two of them as opposed to finding just one. Other positions about natural kinds include realism. This is the other position that I contrast with naturalism. An analog to realism about universals or abstract objects. This is just the claim that natural kinds are real things that we are ontologically committed to. They're not just something. So naturalism said that natural kinds are naturally occurring, but that doesn't mean they're an abstract object, that there's something that we have some ontological commitment to. What realism is saying, on the other hand, is that natural kinds are something that we are committed to existing, that a kind is a type of thing that exists, not just the members of that kind, but it as a kind exists. Whereas cluster kind realism, on the other hand, says natural kinds are just co-occurring clusters of properties used for induction, that it kind of reduces or builds back natural kinds to just clusters of properties. And fundamentalism, which claims that natural kinds are in fact fundamental entities, on the other hand, that can't be reduced to properties or universals or something else in our ontology. Once again, we're going to dig into these positions a little bit more in future videos. For now, we're just kind of laying out the landscape. Now, beyond these kind of metaphysical questions surrounding natural kinds, there are questions in the philosophy of science which ask whether kind of these metaphysical understandings of natural kinds can actually be mapped onto the terms that scientists use. Do these complicated metaphysical ideas actually correspond to ideas in science, or are philosophers out of touch with what science is actually doing? This looks different for each scientific discipline. It seems that there might be a good argument for naturalism in a particular discipline, but conventionalism in another, or promiscuous realism in another. Here we're going to briefly examine chemistry, biology, and psychology. So, nowhere are natural kinds as obvious as in chemistry, and nowhere does it seem as there a better case for at least naturalism about natural kinds than in chemistry. It seems that elements and even compounds seem to be some of the most easily distinguishable and naturally occurring natural kinds. It seems that we didn't just arbitrarily say that hydrogen and helium are different things. There is a observable and real natural difference between having that one extra proton or not. It seems that elements like gold or tellurium naturally fall into various categories based on the number of protons around their nuclei. We didn't just arbitrarily pick a way of categorizing these elements. They fell into those categories naturally. Compounds like water and acetic acid naturally fall into categories based on the elements present and how they bond. This all leads to a position known as microstructuralism, which claims that chemical kinds can be distinguished based on microstructural properties, number of protons, the shape of atoms, bonds, etc., solely. So we're not distinguishing elements based on their look, their touch, their feel, their taste, but rather based on their microstructural properties. As I said, if there's a case anywhere for naturalism in science, that there are real natural kinds, it seems chemistry probably has the best case. But one might even be concerned about chemistry, thinking about elements whose atoms might have perhaps an extra neutron, but the same number of protons. Are what about the microstructural properties makes those two things the same, but adding an extra proton doesn't? There's other concerns that we can bring in here, but if there's a case anywhere for naturalism, it's probably in chemistry. Biology. Now, in biology, in the past, species have been the paradigm example of natural kinds, yet lately this has come under some serious scrutiny, since there are multiple ways to differentiate species which don't always map onto each other. And even these individual ways to differentiate species have a few problems or a few concerns. We can claim that species maybe are organisms that can interbreed, but this gets worrisome when we have species that reproduce asexually or are in fact sterile, or organisms that have descended from a common ancestor, but that also gets confusing in terms of branching and reconnecting and those kind of things. The problem is both that these individual claims seem to have their own problems, but also that those two ways of delineating species are going to pick species differently. So our natural kind of Homo sapien might look differently depending on how we say natural kinds should be separated in terms of biology. So if that natural kind, that species, looks differently just depending on kind of what we say species are, is there really a natural thing that is species out there, or is it just the way we talk about things? This seems to lead us towards a conventionalist conclusion, at least when it comes to biology, namely that species are merely things that biologists talk about, and there's not some deeper existing natural kind that they're discovering about the world, because species seem so fluid and species can change. Or perhaps maybe a promiscuous realist perspective if you think that each of the claims about interbreeding and the claims about descending from a common ancestor can, on their own face, be justified, but perhaps that they could overlap. This is the idea of those overlapping promiscuous realist natural kinds, the idea that you can have a bunch of different ways of delineating species, and they're all natural, but we're just picking out the ones that we want. Finally, psychology we'll touch on briefly, because it's difficult to expound on the positions on natural kinds in psychology without delving too deeply into the philosophy of mind, but simply the proponent of psychological natural kinds needs to demonstrate that things like beliefs, desires, fears, hopes, or other mental states or propositional attitudes constitute natural kinds in the same sense that elements do or species do. And we're going to run into a lot of difficulties here, because just as there is a question as to whether these mental states can be reduced to physical kind of brain states, or if they're multiply realizable by things like computers or aliens that have drastically different brain chemistry, there's also a question as to whether or not these natural kinds are simply about physical structure, kind of that microstructuralism we had in chemistry, or about function as well. Are these natural kinds classifying beliefs just in terms of human beliefs, or are they classifying beliefs in terms of beliefs that things like computers or aliens could have as well? And finally, we will very, very briefly touch on semantics, because we don't want to get into philosophy of language too much here, but natural kinds are also intertwined with the philosophy of language, as they can be both predicates, such as is hydrogen or is an eagle, or individual terms such as carbon dioxide or the cat. There's a debate here as to whether a term means a description which is satisfied by members of a kind. So it's just an objective description which particular members of a kind satisfy, and things that aren't members of that kind don't satisfy. Or what in fact secures the reference of a term, what in fact secures the members of that kind, is not the description itself, but it's an in fact internal component to competent users of the term. Basically, that kinds are what the people that use the word kinds think that those kinds mean. And that's a position called internalism. So, that was a lot of information. Like I said, we're going to delve more into natural kinds in the future, into all of these different positions. But for now, what do you think? Do natural kinds exist? Or are they just ways that we talk about the world? Is science in the business of discovering natural groupings in the world that are independent of what we think about them? Or is it simply arbitrarily delineating categories that have no natural distinctions? Is this the same for all scientific disciplines, or are there some disciplines that are studying natural kinds and some disciplines that are just kind of deciding categories on their own? What do you think? Offer your answers in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.